Hey folks, it's Nate, and today we're going to be fixing up the suspension on this LJ. So stick with me if you want to find out what the heck I've been wheeling on for the past 6 years, and find out what I'm finally upgrading to. Alright, up until this point, the LJ has definitely fallen into the cobbled together, built on a shoestring budget category of Jeep builds. I've done a number of things to try to experiment and build this thing as cheaply as possible. First of all, because I'd like to bring that sort of content to you guys, and second of all, because I just haven't had a lot of money to pour into the Jeep. Today that changes. I'm going to take my relatively worn out and beat up Rubicon Express short control arms and my Jeep Wrangler JK Sport springs that are on my LJ and take them out and replace them with some rebuilt Clayton short arms and some ARB Old Man EMU springs. Now these springs are supposed to give me 2 inches of lift. They're supposed to be tuned for the weight and size of the LJ, and these are their heavy-duty springs, which if you read around online, you'll hear that the rear gives you slightly more than 2 inches of lift, but once you load it up with all of your gear, that's supposed to level it back out again. So we're going to see how this goes. So in this video, we're going to cover removing and replacing the control arms, how to readjust and realign the front end, not like shop quality, but at least to get it in a good ballpark so it'll drive down the road. Get the springs in there, and even replace the shocks. I've got some old worn out Quadratec shocks on there. We're going to replace them with some Bilstein shocks. And I run into a couple snags along the way that we'll cover. Alright folks, so step number one in this sort of a project is to tear out the old suspension. Now I already told you I'm replacing the springs, the shocks, and the control arms. So what I'm doing here is carefully removing everything, except at the moment for the control arms. In order to get the suspension out, basically what I did is I disconnected the track bar and I disconnected the steering stabilizer so there was less things binding against the axle while I was trying to lower it. Then I lowered it as far as it would go. The shocks are the next thing that limit your down travel. So once it was down that far, I took my jack and brought it back up about an inch or so to get the tension off of the shocks. I took the shocks out, which ended up with a broken bolt or two already. So this is going to be fun. So they're going to have to be replaced when I put this all back together again. I disconnected the anti-rock. That would have been here. Oh, and I disconnected the drive shaft, the front drive shaft. Now, old school trick here. You can see that. I've wrapped my U-joint in blue painter's tape. You don't have to use painter's tape, but basically that is a cheap way to keep your U-joint from falling apart. This is a great time to inspect that U-joint, though. This one happens to be in good shape, so I'm going to keep it. The next step, now obviously if you were replacing steering or something, you could tear that out at this point. I'm leaving it on, well, one, because I'm not replacing it, and two, because the next thing I need to figure out is ride height. Because when I do the control arms, I'm going to be going from control arms that are known to be like decent alignment, but not perfect, right? So I'm not going to trust the measurements on the old arms. What I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out where this axle needs to sit. And then I'm going to take off the control arms and put on the new ones. The new control arms are going to be all wrong lengths, and I'm going to have to basically align the axle. Now, Nate over at Dirt Lifestyle did a video on how to do that better than I probably could. I'll probably show you the process as I'm going, but if you want to learn why and how and everything, go check out his video. I'll link it in the description at the bottom. But he did it better than I could. Just go check out his video. I also had to pull the brakes, obviously, because the brake lines would have been a limiting point at this point. You definitely do not want to put that kind of pressure on your brake lines. So what I did is I took the calipers off, I took the rotors off, and then I've hung the calipers here. This way you don't have to worry about bleeding the brakes later. Will I need new brake lines? I don't think so. ARB does not say you need new brake lines when you buy their kit. We'll see once it's on. If these feel too short to me, I'm certainly going to buy new brake lines. I'm not going to chance that. That's one of those things you don't want to mess around with. Then we got to figure out ride height. So you might wonder, my Jeep is sitting on the floor if I take off the control arms and the springs and whatnot, how the hell do I figure out ride height? The way I'm going to do it is I'm going to keep the old control arms on for now, and I'm going to put the new springs in and get the weight of the vehicle on the new springs. Once they're on there, I will measure from the frame to the axle. Ride height. Then I'll take the springs back out, and I will put jack stands underneath the axle and get it close to the same distance from the frame to the axle. Simple as that. What was that? Alright folks, that got a little bit hairy just for a second. Working with suspension in a garage like this without a lift can get hairy. And that's basically because you're dealing with a bunch of tension and a bunch of weight. This vehicle weighs a lot. And all I got is jack stands to hold it up. The springs are, of course, a bunch of force that I'm trying to force out of the shape they want to be in. That's how a spring works. So while I was trying to position this thing so that it was on stands at ride height, there's only so many flat surfaces or so many surfaces, clear surfaces on the bottom of this axle that I can get to and still get the jack underneath. So what happened was I was using the bottom of the control arm as a place to put, not the control arm itself, but the joint at the end, as a place to put my jacks. And they're just slightly curved. And well, as I was working, that one over there decided to give a little bit. The whole Jeep moved about an inch this way, almost off the stand over there. That would have been bad. Anyway, so I quickly got the measurements as close to ride height as I could without feeling unsafe. And that measurement is about 7.5 to 8 inches from the top of this bracket here where the shock mounts, which is basically the whole coil bucket, to the frame right here at this curve. So I now have the spring back out. The axle is simply being held up by a jack. Actually, it's held up by these jack stands now. Drive shaft is off, brakes are off, suspension's all off. The only thing that's left on this thing is the steering and, of course, the control arms. Now, the control arms are going to come off, and they're probably next on my list. But what I have to do now is I'm going to find the center line of the Jeep, or at least the center line of the front of the Jeep. And then I'm going to try to find, that could be difficult, the center line of the axle. And then the two need to line up. That's the whole point. Axle needs to be centered under the Jeep. What I've done here, I went out and got myself one of these laser levels. You can see it in frame here. You probably can't, it's just off frame. I needed to find a way to sort of cast a line down the whole center of the Jeep. So what I did is I took a chalk line, I found the center of the front of the Jeep, hung a plumb bob down to the floor and made a mark. On the rear I did the same thing. Then I put a chalk line from the rear of the Jeep all the way to the front of the Jeep. Laser level casts a very nice line across the floor, which you should be able to see right here along with the chalk. And then, of course, it casts it all the way up. You should see it casting onto the axle there, right? The axle, I found the middle, which is 19.5 inches in from, I used the sway bar link mounts because they happen to stick out far enough to clear the diff. The measurement across is 39 inches on the dot, so I went 19.5, which I think is half of 39, and I made a mark on the axle housing. I did it wrong twice, and then I got it right. And turns out, after all that, the axle's already centered. When I got to 19.5, the line from this thing cast directly onto my tape measure at 19.5. It's perfectly dead on center. I mean, within probably a 32nd of an inch. So, I'm going to make sure the track bar is adjusted to the point where, at this axle height, which should be ride height, the track bar basically bolts right in place without any friction. Then I'm probably going to take the track bar back off, because the next thing I need to do is get the control arms out. So what I'm going to do is use the old arms to be sort of a reference point for the new arms, because now I know that it's already centered. That means that these arms shouldn't be too far off. They shouldn't be interfering with the center of the axle. So now what I should be able to do is take the new arms and set them to the same measurements as the old arms, and then get them back into the Jeep. Once they're in the Jeep, I will have to figure out caster and whether the axle is square with the Jeep, right? Whether it's tilted this way or that. And that'll all be measurements from the frame, you know, from a point on the frame to a point on the axle, right? So I'm going to get started with that. Now the way to do this is basically you need to find a point on your frame and measure from that to the back of the axle. Simple as that, right? So here's what we're going to do. Got my laser line. I'm just going to line it up with as close as I think I can get to the center of that control arm bolt access hole in the TJ frame. I'm going to take my tape measure and measure to the back of the axle housing. Now, full disclosure, I've already done this, and the axle is, believe it or not, square. It falls at just under a foot. It's like 11 inches and 7/8. And I checked it on both sides, and it's within that 7/8 on both sides. The axle is square. So basically what this means is these control arms, aside from caster, are pretty good off, I think, for alignment, now that I've centered the axle and whatnot. So now the next question is caster. I have to drill out the upper mounting holes for my control arms. The Clayton arms have a larger diameter upper mounting bolt than these factory arms and the Rubicon Express arms do, which is arguably a good thing. But it means you got to drill out. So if you can see it, there's an access hole right here. It's the one I measured to before. This is where you'd normally get access to the nut that goes on the bolt that holds your control arm in. You can get access to the holes, of course, where the bolt goes through here. The problem is my normal size is like a standard size drill bit. This is my 1/2-inch drill bit. It is, let's see, minus the shank, it's like 3.5 inches long, 3 5/8. I just had to go to the hardware store and get a much longer one. And this one is really just barely long enough. Let's see how long this one is. They did have a longer one, but... So minus the shank, it's about 1 inch longer. It's 4.5 inches. You see I have it not fully mated with the chuck here, and that's because I needed that extra room to get the other one out, or get it drilled. And in all, it's about 5.5 inches from the chuck up to here. You can see this little shoulder I accidentally wore into the chuck here. That's because I had to get it right up against this hole on the other side to get it through. So we're going to go ahead and drill this quick. It doesn't take much to get through. But basically you have to get some speed, otherwise it just binds the drill up. And then the motor on the drill likes to let out the magic smoke, and you got to be careful of that. Okay, I think we're through. The way to test, I'll just take the 1/2-inch drill bit, take it through from the other side, I think. Nope, too long. Let me go get the other bolt. So for comparison's sake, this is the bolt that came out of the factory control arm. This is the bolt that came out of the Clayton arm. So much thicker. This is a 1/2-inch. This is like, I don't know, it's metric. I don't know exactly how big it is, but it's much smaller. Now, this end doesn't change, so really you're only gaining strength at the frame end, but it is what it is. I got the old control arms off. I have the Clayton lowers on. That was kind of a job. At the moment, what I'm trying to do is set the caster angle. Now, there's not a whole lot of flat spots on top of this housing. What I'm trying to do is use the top of the C as where I'm measuring caster from. Now, the internet says that 7 degrees of caster, 7 degrees, I think they call it negative caster, which means tilted toward the back of the vehicle, is the thing you want to shoot for. Or I should say, is what these come from the factory with, the TJ. All right, now they say that you don't have to change it much for larger tires, but that 6 degrees is a good shot. It's currently at 5. So what I got is a little jack, not a little, I've got my floor jack under the steering linkage, and I'm just slowly moving it up a little bit until I get about 6. .7. 6.0. I mean, they say as close to 6 as you can. That's as close to 6 as I can get. What I need to do now is try to find a way to keep it there, right? Alright, so now I've got the upper and lower control arms on. I've got the caster set. The axle is a little more forward from its original position, which I don't love. The track bar contacts the pumpkin in the front at an even higher location than it used to, which I don't love. I'm trying to roll with it. So what I'm trying to do now is figure out if the proper thing to do is to simply extend the front bump stops. Because obviously, when you put on lift springs, you don't want to over-compress them because you end up with coil bind. That's not good for the springs. You also don't want to contact pieces of your suspension, pieces of your steering, whatever, right? So what I'm doing now is I'm testing the articulation of the front suspension. Now I've got the track bar back on. I've got the upper and lower control arms on. They're all snug fit. They're not tightened down. They're not torqued down or anything. They're all adjusted where I think they're supposed to be. I've got the passenger side lifted all the way up. Now, what you're going to see here as I cycle this is some of the sort of downsides of this quote-unquote 5-link suspension system. That is the 4 upper links, or the 4 links with the track bar, right? And that is that you get sort of uneven articulation. Notice that the driver's side right now is touching the garage floor. The passenger side can't flex that far down because the track bar binds before it gets there. So at this point in the project, I hit what I thought was a roadblock, but really it just turned out to be me overthinking a few things. I obsessed for quite a bit of time over the fact that the Clayton control arms pushed the front axle forward not even an inch, about 3/4 of an inch, over the Rubicon Express arms. So I contacted Clayton. That's how concerned I was over this. And they said that at their shortest configuration, their arms should be identical to the stock control arms. Now, I do not know if that's the same case for Rubicon Express because I didn't reach out to them. But what I think happened here is that the Rubicon Express arms were simply adjustable to a shorter than stock configuration. And that's how I ended up with this. So I spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out how to position the axle in the right way. I spent a bunch of time trying to cycle the suspension up and down to try to figure out where things were touching and binding. And really, all it came down to was, I need longer bump stops. So I thought about building bump stops, but really, for the cost of TJ extended bump stops, it was really simple to just go on Amazon, buy some extended bump stops, and screw them in place. I don't show them yet in the video, but that is what the solution was. Now, I had never bothered to extend the bump stops on the front of this Jeep because of the cobbled together suspension that I was running. And I had a couple issues because of that. So if you're going to design your own suspension, keep this stuff in mind. You really need to look for clearances on your front suspension. I actually ended up damaging the cooling lines for the transmission that run to the bottom of the radiator, and subsequently damaging the radiator because the steering actually contacted those lines in the right conditions off-road. And I discovered all that damage as I started taking things apart for this project. And that added quite a bit of time to the project as well, because now I had to fix that. I ended up in the middle of the suspension upgrades replacing my radiator because it was damaged from my lack of bump stops. Watch this drag link. Turn that way. Fine. Turn this way. Bink! Right into the radiator. Now, before, the axle was just a slight bit further back. And I think that's how that got bent. It got up into the line instead of hitting the radiator. Not that hitting the radiator is any better, but check this stuff out, folks. Bump stops are more important than some people think they are. Alright, so at this point, I had to put the springs back in. Obviously, we're at that point in the suspension install. We're getting close, guys. So with the suspension drooped all the way out like this, you could almost just drop the springs right in there. But on the passenger side, it's just not always quite that easy. With the track bar connected, you can't get the lower, you can't get the passenger side to droop far enough. So I know that coil spring compressors get a bad rap. A lot of folks on social media always post those, "Oh my God, I'm using my spring compressors. If I don't come back in 10 minutes, please call an ambulance," yada, yada, yada. Coil spring compressors can be dangerous, but just like any tool, if you treat them with respect, they are invaluable. I don't know how else you're going to get a spring into certain suspension situations without them. So there's a couple tricks on how to use these things. You can see me here in this video, just doing them the old-fashioned way with a ratchet. There's also a nice trick where if you have a spring that's already on a vehicle, you can have it compressed by have the spring compressed by the weight of the vehicle, and then get the spring compressor on there while it's still in a compressed state, and then just drop the axle out from underneath it, and they're so much easier and safer to use that way. So yeah, use spring compressors when you need to. Don't be afraid of them, folks. They get a bad rap on social media because people that don't know how to use them, use them. So I got to admit, at this point, I was getting a bit, well, crunched for time. So I finished up the front suspension and didn't get a whole lot of footage of it. Most of what I've got here in the video really covered, well, most of the front suspension. The only thing I didn't get was shocks. So what you need to do is, unless you bought a kit that included shocks that were right for your springs, you need to figure out what size shocks you need. The way to do that is to, again, based on your measurements for ride height, you need to flex the suspension up as high as you think it needs to flex until it hits your bump stop. In my case, I didn't have bump stops yet, but I measured and figured out where they were going to stop. And then you need to droop it as far as you think is reasonable to droop, and now you've got your fully compressed and fully extended lengths for shocks. And then you got to go shock shopping. I ended up buying some Bilstein 5100 shocks because they were just slightly more than I was comfortable paying for a shock, and I figured that probably means that they're the best shocks I'll ever have. Anyway, I bought some shocks. I'll link the shocks in the description if anybody's curious about which ones I bought. I also bought a set for the rear. Again, crunched for time. I had not had the rear suspension done yet when I bought the shocks, and they were too short. All right, folks, so the rear suspension, I was in quite a time crunch, and I basically recorded nothing. In fact, I recorded absolutely nothing. I did it in one evening, took me like 6 hours, started right after dinner, and worked until like 2 in the morning to get the thing done. That was including a quick test drive. I want to say that I love the ride of these Old Man EMU springs, and the Bilstein shocks really make this thing handle nicely. It takes bumps so much better than it used to. Now, obviously, the suspension I had on was really cobbled together, so you can understand why this would be such a big improvement, but to be honest, I'm really happy. The one thing I didn't touch in this video is that the steering stabilizer, I basically ran into some clearance problems. I talked about that at the beginning. After I got the lift on, the steering stabilizer actually clears a lot better than it used to, but the old steering stabilizer bracket that I had was damaged, so I had to order a new one, which led to a whole fiasco of trying to find a new mounting bolt for the steering stabilizer to the steering stabilizer mount that goes on to the steering. I ended up having to buy a whole new steering stabilizer, which I was probably due anyway, so whatever. New steering stabilizer is in now. The Jeep's pretty much trail ready at this point. I do need to readjust the front anti-rock, but in all, I think I'm ready to hit some trails. So folks, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it helped you out. If you liked what you saw here, please hit that like button. If you want to see more content like this with the TJ/LJ, or even with the work I'm doing to the JK, I gotta say, now that I have this suspension handling better, I'm really thinking about putting one on the JKU, but that's really up to the wife. So anyway, folks, thanks for watching. Remember, get out there and wheel, and I'll see you in the next one.